Hello students, welcome to the Analyst, dated 7th of September 2023. Today we'll look at 5 important articles from the Indian Express and the Hindu. The first article will be regarding the Prime Minister's article in the Express. Then we'll look at Indo-US Relationship. Then we'll look at Quad and Indo-Pacific. Finally, we'll look at two important prelim pointers. One is the SPG Special Protection Group and the East Asia Summit. Now, the first article pertains to your GS2, International Relations and various groupings. Now, the Prime Minister calls the G20 for We the People. India, being the president this year, having the chair of G20, is looking for a human-centric development as well as globalization. And in this context, he jots down this article. Now let's look at the message of Prime Minister. So he talks about the theme Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, where one earth, one family and one future. Now let's decode it. One earth, that means common problems, which we also call global commons. They are one and the same. A very good example can be your climate change. Then the world is one family. So despite of we having various cultures, divides, boundaries, languages, so we have multiple identities across the world. Despite that, the world is one family. So Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And then one future. So one future pertains to your sustainability. The debate about need and greed. Given that the issues that the earth today faces are common for everyone and the future of the earth will be common. Therefore, India as the lead of G20 wishes to look at various commons and works on inclusive solutions. So the Prime Minister talks about the post-pandemic world. Now, what did we see in the pandemic? We saw the issue of ecology affecting humanity. So the idea of the virus coming from, let's say, wet meat or wet markets. So these markets are usually found in Southeast Asia. So the moment we are going for wildlife poaching, etc., what are we doing? We are going for ecological destruction. We are destabilizing the ecology. And therefore it affected the humanity. So post-COVID, a lot of realities have come to the world and therefore some common solutions have to be achieved. And this calls for movement from GDP-centric to human-centric progress. That means people at the core. And when we say people, who needs the support of the government? So it is the last person in the line. It is the little man. Then he talks about resilience and reliability in global supply chain. Why? Because the world started depending on China. Why? Because it is the manufacturing giant of the world. So now what are we doing? China plus one. So supply chain resilience, it is one of the major issues that is discussed on all fora. So apart from climate change, these are the major themes that are discussed all across the fora. So climate change, supply chain resilience, energy transitions. These are the keywords that we'll read time and again. Then about multilateralism. Why? Because we cannot have a unipolar world. Also, we cannot have a bipolar world. Bipolar, remember the Cold War era? and unipolar post-Cold War, right? The dominance of the West, the dominance of the hegemon US. So we need to move towards a more balanced world where multilateral institutions, global institutions have fair representation from all across the world. So some important ideas that he shared was mainstreaming the aspirations of global South. And when we say global South, we not only mean the countries situated geographically in South, but also economically. So economic divides between the rich and the poor in form of, let's say, least developed countries, or we can say third world countries, or small island developing countries, or emerging economies, or developing economies. So all these keywords which signify basically the non-Western model of development. So inclusion of all the countries, whether they are big or small, their fair representation across fora. Then he proposed for African Union to become a part of the G20, to have fair representation from all continents. Then a G20 action plan for accelerating SDGs. Why? Because the sustainable development goals are essential for not only targeting issues like poverty and hunger, but they are also important for fighting climate change, as well as targeting clean water and more greener urban spaces. Then he talks about democratic climate action, the idea of climate justice. So let's say the West got 200 odd years to industrialize themselves. But how many years have passed for India post independence? 75 years, right? So do we have the right amount of opportunity to develop till this point of time? And what about the countries which are still facing conflicts? So we cannot treat the West at par with India, or at par with emerging economies, or at par with, let's say, the LDCs, the third world country, the fourth world countries, right? Where there is conflict, there is lack of democracy. Institutions are not yet created. Why? Because the West got its fair or just time for development. Also, it utilized all the resources. So today we cannot say that because there is climate change, so everyone should stop developing, everyone should stop using coal power, or any form of carbon intensive work should be stopped. Why? Because it is against democratic climate action, and which calls for climate justice. Then, when we are talking about global commons like climate change, the mitigation, the adaptation should also follow with climate finance. And naturally, if you got 200 years of development, you created a lot of carbon emissions. So naturally, with this development, you must share some dividends with the countries that need the most, like emerging economies, third world countries. So the countries which are yet to develop, you should share some burden of their development by contributing through climate finance. But that is not happening. Then the Prime Minister also talked about the wisdom that comes from ancient India, that is the idea of life, which entails living in harmony with nature. So sustainability is essentially part of the Indic way of living. Then he talks about initiatives like clean and green energy, targeting solar power, targeting wind power, targeting blue economy, and a resilient blue economy, not an exploitative blue economy. And whenever we are talking about blue economy, we are essentially talking about moving from land to seas. Why? Because the seas offer newer opportunities. opportunities in terms of, let's say, food, let's say fishing, trade, minerals. Then he also talked about the green hydrogen. Now, whenever we say hydrogen, so there are multiple types of hydrogen, but let's say I break H2O and I get some hydrogen. If to do this hydrolysis, I am using clean energy. If I am using clean energy to break a molecule of H2O, that is water, then it is called a green hydrogen. So India is also working on green hydrogen projects. Then the International Solar Alliance, which talked about finance and technology. So technology transfers, finance, state of the art machinery. So sharing the know-how of solar energy with the region between Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. Why? Because they have more potential to develop solar energy. Then talking about Global Biofuel Alliance. Why? Because let's say today we have some starch. We have, let's say, some rotten wheat, or we have some wasteful sugarcane. So can we convert this into biofuel? And therefore, can we make our farmers energypreneurs? Why? Because they become part of the energy economy. So from farmers to energypreneurs. How to convert this? Through use of biofuels. Why? Because extra crops, wasteful crops, any foliage, any kind of wastage that is in farm produce can be used today for making more biofuel, and these biofuels can be then blended and can be used to fuel our cars. Then talking about food and nutritional security, and more particularly the focus on millets. Why millets? Because the world is looking at climate change. Then we are looking at millets which are non-water guzzling. Then these are resilient crops. That means their toleration capacity in terms of, let's say, there is some climate change, there are changes, variations in the weather patterns. Then these crops are extremely resilient and they are suited to regions which follow dryland farming, as well as, let's say, regions which are semi-arid. So ragi, jowar and bajra. And therefore we are also looking at more value addition of millets by creating, let's say, ragi chips. So that's a good case study that you can take up. Or internationalization of millets, as well as doubling farmer income and focusing on millets. Why? Because India has had the problem of creating a rice wheat system because of institutional supports like MSP, right? Then Prime Minister talked about making technology inclusive. So technology should not create new divides. Let's say we do progress in space technology, but only the billionaires are able to afford, let's say, a travel to moon, and the rest of the people are not able to travel. So what happens? A divide, a technology divide. But India used technology to bridge divides, and the biggest example, the success model of UPI, Bheem, Aadhaar, and probably the second layer in form of ONDC. Then he talked about mainstreaming women in all sectors of economy. And so he talked about women-led development. From what? From development of women. So that is about change of ideas. Now you can use this content anywhere. Let's say you're writing some essay, or you are adding some fodder points, you are using, let's say, introductions and conclusions. So there you can use such fodder points. They are very good in terms of your introductions, conclusion, as well as going for the macro ideas. So there are some micro ideas, let's say sectoral ideas, let's say smaller interventions. But whenever the Prime Minister is addressing, whenever he talks about some larger issues, so they become very good fodder for writing extremely lucid introductions and conclusions. Now, the second article is pertaining to the upcoming visit of the US President, and this pertains to your GS2. Now, let's look at a very good introduction to the Indo-US relationship. So, the Indo-US bilateral relations have developed into a global strategic partnership, spanning global strategic partnership based upon shared democratic values, because both are democracies, and increasing convergence of interest, not only in one sector but across sectors and on bilateral, regional as well as global issues. Now let's look at the backdrop. So first was the Cold War dynamics. So relations started back in 1947, but till the Cold War, because India was leaning towards the Soviet or the USSR, so the relations did not fructify much. Then sanctions were imposed with the nuclear tests that India conducted. But the relation opened up post the economic reforms with US companies investing in India, as well as leading to the IT boom in India. Then counter-terrorism based cooperation started post 9/11. Why? Because this became a common threat. And post 2005, after the civil nuclear deal for peaceful use of nuclear energy, despite India not being a signatory to non-proliferation treaty. So post 2005, it really picked up. Now let's look at some defense cooperation that we are involved in. So in terms of defense cooperation, in 2005, we went for the new framework for India-US defense cooperation. Then in 2016, India became a major defense partner. And why these events are important? Because with more involvement of Indo-US, we get sensitive technology. We get dual use technology. As well as there are multi-sectoral cooperation, let's say on logistics, LEMUA, this happened in 2016, about communications in 2018, about industrial security agreement in 2019, and then BECA in 2020. So these fundamental agreements, these defense agreements lay the foundation for India-US defense cooperation and the upcoming technology transfer deals that we are looking at. Then India also got Tier 1 of strategic trade authorization license. Now why these things are important? Because let's say there is a US major called General Electric or General Atomic. Let's say it wants to go for a $10 billion deal in terms of transfer of some, let's say, weapons as well as some technology. So General Electric or General Atomic cannot do this. Why? Because this is sensitive technology and it is not allowed in terms of the US law. So to transfer such tech or weapon, it will need executive approval. And then it will also need legislative approval. Because this technology is cutting edge technology, which is usually not shared except for NATO membership. Now, we also go for multiple bilateral exercises, and this can become a very good prelim pointer. Example, Yudh Abhyas, this is for army, then Vajra Prahar for special forces, then tri-service regarding Tiger Triumph, then Malabar exercise. And in Malabar, Australia also started participating. So, Malabar is about Japan, India and US, and this is a naval exercise. So, Australia also started participating in the Malabar exercise. Now, when we look at trade and economic relations, so US is India's biggest trading partner, and let's look at the figures. So, trade is $128 billion, out of which exports are $78 billion and imports are $50 billion. That means we have a trade surplus. Also, we got the highest ever FDI during the COVID times of $80 billion. So not only we trade, but we also involve in investing in each other's companies. Then US is also one of the biggest source of seed funding and angel investing for Indian startups. And then together they also launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This is to work with 14 partner countries, and this is in the context of a rising China, which is distorting trade. So India, rather than going for a RCEP, wants to join something with the US. So US plus its trading partners, if they create a framework for free and fair trade, so India would like to be a partner with the West rather than trading with a group or a trade bloc which involves China, because of unfair dumping and pumping of goods into the Indian economy, and thereby deindustrializing, demanufacturing and disrupting the jobs. Now, India joined 3 pillars of IPEF. One is supply chain. Again, we see the same keyword, supply chain resilience. And this is the post-COVID world. Then tax and anti-corruption. Why? Because India is also vouching for global minimum taxation. And then clean energy. Why? India is also going for climate action, climate mitigation in form of sustainable energy transitions. Now, what is the key agenda of the upcoming meeting? So, the first is a nuclear pact is possible for small modular nuclear reactors, and this will be between Westinghouse and NPCIL. Then a STEM course. Why? Because a lot of Indian students would like to go for STEM courses abroad to the US. And this is a very major issue, whether it is about visas, whether it is about education. So a year-long master's degree with specialization in particular industry, but more importantly, option of staying up to 3 years. So work visa. Then a drone deal, and this is a buy deal. So this is to directly procure the General Atomic MQ-9B HALE UAVs. Then the US Congress has already approved. So in the previous visit, Prime Minister got this deal. This deal has now been approved. The jet engine deal between HAL and General Electric. And this is for what? This is for LCA, Light Combat Aircraft, made by HAL, and its second version, MK2. So for this we need GEF 414 engines. Now, why I am emphasizing on these keywords? Because what can happen is this keyword F414, so they will make a question, F414 has been in news because of, so 4 options, right? So try to remember these important keywords, or LCA. Then there are many such terms, some defense weapons terms. Good examples are, let's say, MR-SAM, LR-SAM, so medium range surface to air missile. So these keywords, terminologies one should know. Then a talk on joint humanitarian aid for Ukraine. Why this is important? Because US wants India to change its stance, not buy oil from Russia, but there has been a difference. US has pumped a lot of billions of dollars for weapons, while India has provided aid to Ukraine, humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Now, if they together do it, so they find a common ground. Then, most importantly, a liberal visa regime for Indians as well as opening new consulates. So, we will look at the progress post the meeting and post this G20 events. So, the third article points out that India looks to invite Quad leaders on Republic Day parade. Now, this again pertains to your GS2, International Relations. So, what is its significance? So, we are looking at G20 event where the Chinese president will not be coming. Then, parallelly, what do we see? We see that the issues of, let's say, Galwan, Doklam, and the LAC has not been sorted out. Then, the US issued a statement that it is upon China to decide whether it wants to create issues or it wants to solve those issues. But China is giving it a miss. And therefore, our Prime Minister is also currently on a visit to Jakarta, Indonesia. Why? To have ASEAN, to attend ASEAN and East Asia Summit. Now, in this backdrop, we will also host the G20 event in Delhi. And if we make such an announcement, or if all the Quad member agrees, and who are these Quad members? So it is US, Australia, Japan, and India. And majority of these countries, they have a trade deficit with China. So if they announce that they will be coming on Republic Day, then it will be a very hard hit to Chinese assertiveness as well as Chinese unilateralism. So China adopts its unilateral models and its aggressive stance against its smaller neighbors. And surprisingly, China has more disputes with countries pertaining to border than it actually shares those borders. So let's say I am sharing my border with 5 countries, but I have dispute with 15 countries. Why? Because of these artificial maps. So every day China will wake up and create a new map. And one day it will take up, let's say, Bhutan. Another day, Arunachal Pradesh. Then it will call Nepal one of the 5 fingers. So China says 5 fingers. Ladakh, Aksai Chin, then Nepal, then Arunachal, then Bhutan, then Sikkim. So it calls it all these regions as 5 fingers of Tibet. Right? Then it will issue staple visas. So all those issues China has created. Then China will also involve in creating 9 dash line, where in South China Sea and to bully its smaller neighbors. And who are these smaller neighbors? Good examples are, let's say, Mongolia, or let's say Philippines. So China will always try to bully them. So Quad started as a joint effort for humanitarian aid. Post tsunami in 2004. But it over the period of time evolved into a strategic grouping. Also, the Indo-Pacific region was earlier referred to Asia Pacific, and gradually Indo-Pacific term has been used. And if this is, let's say, the Indian Ocean region, and if this is Pacific, so in between lies the ASEAN countries. So whenever we are talking about Indo-Pacific, ASEAN centrality is core to policy of all the Quad members. Now, what are the objectives? So the objectives are also evolving. So whether it is about, let's say, maritime security, following international law in terms of UNCLOS laws. So no unilateral measures to declare territory or to take away territory or to harass small nations. Then open seas for trade and commerce. Then to counter China's increasing assertiveness in the region. So it is about a pivot to Asia. Now, in early times, the Quad faced a lot of issues. So Australia was never willing to join Quad. Why? Because Australia gets a lot of dollars or money from China because it exports resources, and China is resource hungry. But over the period of time, this stance has drastically changed. India, on the other hand, wanted to trade with China and never wanted to pick a side. Pick, let's say, the West. So it never wanted to become a puppet of West. So it avoided any kind of conflict. But then what happened is conflict came to the door in form of, let's say, Galwan, Doklam, Chumbi Valley. Then simultaneously came the issue of China going for one belt, one road. And a component of one belt, one road is China-Pakistan economic corridor. And China-Pakistan economic corridor crosses from POK. Then in terrorism, we are also looking at China funding Pakistan, bailing out Pakistan time and again. So what will Pakistan do with these funds? Then shielding the terrorist of Pakistan in front of, let's say, UN. And simultaneously, we have also found weapons, Chinese weapons with terrorists like grenades. Then aiding Pakistan through, let's say, $60 billion of infrastructure. Now, part of this money will naturally flow towards terrorism. So, not only the China-Pakistan economic corridor passed through POK, but also India was looking at a growing convergence of interest of policy between Pakistan and China. Simultaneously, what we are looking at is the Indian Ocean region. So, a string of pearls were being created, and the string of pearls is all about getting ports directly, indirectly in control. And how can they be controlled? Through, let's say, Chinese banks, their PSUs, or their private companies. So, all the three methods to get more and more ports in the Indian Ocean region. Then, some of these ports through funding, some of these ports through the check book diplomacy or the debt trap diplomacy. So, I give you some funds and you are not able to repay. So, instead of the repayment and the interest, I will take away your home. So, it's like you have mortgaged your country by getting some loans from China. So, what China will ask is, just give me the Hambantota port. Just give me the Sitwe port. Just give me Gwadar. Also give me Chabar. So, all ports, any port it will take. Whichever port is not able to pay its debt. So, over the period of time, what we are seeing is that the Indian Ocean region was now becoming a playground of China. And looking at what has happened on Indian borders, what has happened in terms of CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, then what has happened in South China Sea. So, India also required to change its stance. And therefore, when Donald Trump was the president, so back in 2017, suddenly Quad was reinvigorated. Why? Because this was also the time that US and China were fighting a lot on trade. Why? Because the US was accusing China of going for trade distortion through taxation, through funding, through devaluation of yuan, right? Now, what is the Indian stance? So, India now takes up projects like Project Mosam, going for spice route, then security and growth for all in the region, then going for ASEAN centrality, going for blue economy and a blue navy, being the net security provider in Indian Ocean region and also the first responder in terms of any disaster. But with COVID, Quad also evolved itself into newer initiatives like counter-terrorism, vaccines, technology, climate change, and supply chain resilience. So all the emerging themes are also coming under Quad. And now India looks at Quad not only in terms of security, but also in terms of economics, in terms of partnerships of trade, technology, and diffusion of economics. So more and more funding, trade, technology from these partner countries. Now, what are the challenges? That India has to maintain a fine balance between its relation with China as well as with Quad. Why? Because too much pushing towards the West, so India can be used as a trump against China. And therefore, this would be against our strategic autonomy. Therefore, a fine balance, a fine-tuned balance has to be there. Now, SPG is in news and this pertains to your GS3. Now, what was the reason for creation of SPG? Because we faced the assassination of our ex-Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. So it was created with an act of parliament called the SPG Act, and it comes under the Ministry of Home Affairs. And it is an armed force in the SPG Act. That this also tells us that it is beyond the purview of the RTI Act. So armed forces are having immunity from right to information. Then it comes under the Cabinet Secretariat, and it is about providing proximate security to the Prime Minister and the ex-Prime Ministers. So, post the assassination of our ex-Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, the SPG Act was amended, offering SPG protection to all former Prime Ministers and their families for 10 years, and again was amended in 2019. Now, SPG comes directly under the central government, and under the section 14 of SPG Act, the states are mandated. The states will have to compulsorily provide all kinds of help in terms of logistics and whatever demands are there from the SPG whenever the Prime Minister is there in the state. And one lapse happened when the Prime Minister was there in Punjab. That time also SPG was in news. Now we have already discussed ASEAN. So today we look at the East Asia Summit. Now let's look at a statement that the Prime Minister has given today. She said that history and geography unite Bharat and ASEAN. Along with shared values, regional unity, peace, prosperity, and mutual trust in a, again, multipolar world. So the keywords are now becoming more and more common. So multipolar world bind us together. Regional unity, region of ASEAN, Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific. What do you mean by multipolar? That means not unipolar, and certainly not the Cold War era, where two poles or the bipolar model. So multipolarity is the way forward. Peace, prosperity, and mutual trust. Peace, how? So that China is not assertive. It is not going for unilateral measures. Prosperity through more trade, more connectivity, and mutual trust. That means not drawing new maps of each countries, not going for 9-dash line, not going for unilateral measures on the borders. Now, East Asia Summit is formed in 2005 and it has 18 members. So ASEAN having 10 members plus 8. So all the dialogue partners, all the partners of ASEAN along with ASEAN. Now what is the idea? So it is guided by openness and inclusiveness, adherence to international law. That means again against unilateral measures in, let's say, the South China Sea. Then talks about ASEAN centrality and ASEAN's leading role. So India also accepts and the US also accepts the ASEAN's centrality in Indo-Pacific or East Asia or Asia Pacific. Then who are the dialogue partners? So Australia, part of Quad, India, part of Quad, then Japan, part of Quad, United States, part of Quad, and New Zealand, Korea again a US ally, this is again a Chinese ally, New Zealand again West. So this is a very good fora for all the conflicting parties to sit and talk. So whether it is Russia-Ukraine issue or the conflict or the doubts that are created in, let's say, two blocks which are trying to emerge. One is the West and the other is the Russia, China coming together. So both the blocks are sitting together in Jakarta, Indonesia. And the East Asia Summit also aligns with India's policy of Act East. So Act East is a successor of what? Look East. And then we are also looking to connect. So connectivity between India and Southeast Asia via the Northeast, as well as through the Bay of Bengal. Right? So all the global issues, whether it is unilateral measures, whether it is assertiveness, whether it is trade distortion, whether it is Russia-Ukraine, whether it is climate change. So all these issues can be easily discussed in such summits. And who is at the core? ASEAN. Thank you so much. I hope it helped.